My name is Christopher Coker. I'm director of LSE Ideas, which is the foreign policy think tank of the London School of Economics. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of a series of events on China and the Arctic, which looks at China's environmental, geopolitical, economic and normative influence in the Arctic, which is increasing all the time. This series is a joint initiative of the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø and LSE Ideas China Foresight Program. And it's intended to help academics, policymakers, and other interested parties understand the implications of China's growing influence in the Arctic, not only in the traditional security field of interstate relations, but also the new security fields of the environment and governance in general. I will be handing over to the chair of this meeting, who is Rasmus Bertelsen, Professor of Northern Studies and the first Barents Professor in Politics at the Arctic University. Rasmus's academic affiliations are truly impressive. They number Cambridge, Harvard, the United Nations University at Yokohama, and Aalborg University in Denmark. And last year, he was on sabbatical leave at the University of the Sorbonne in Paris. His interests are very much on the Arctic, but he has other interests as well. He's coordinator of the Norway-EU Science Diplomacy Network, and I could go on, but I shall not. We have a very, very good panel, and we're going to have, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion. So Rasmus, let me turn over the meeting to you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and welcome to all, and welcome to three close colleagues of mine at the UIT, the Arctic University of Norway. I'm very pleased to chair this event on China and the Arctic, which is, as Christopher mentioned, an ongoing cooperation between the LSE and the Arctic University of Norway. And in this connection, I'd like to acknowledge our colleagues, Professor Krista Porsiainen from UIT, the Arctic University of Norway, and Professor Chris Alden from the LSE, who are the instigators of this cooperation. So I'm very pleased to introduce my three colleagues from the Arctic University of Norway to present to you the range of research on Arctic security and China and the Arctic at the Arctic University of Norway. First, you will hear from Professor Gunhild Haagensen, Professor of Security, Peace and Conflict Studies at the Center for Peace Studies. Professor Haagensen specializes in theories of security, in particular the constellation between everyday security as ontological and human security and state security perspectives. And she examines perceptions of security in context of the Arctic, civil military interventions, example Afghanistan, and hybrid threats and warfare. And secondly, you will hear from Dr. Marc Lanteigne, Associate Professor of Political Science at UIT, who specializes in China, East Asia, and polar regional politics and international relations. Dr. Lanteigne is the chief editor of the Arctic news blog Over the Circle, and his current research includes work on comparative politics of non-Arctic states, including in the Asia Pacific, within the Arctic policy sphere. And the last presenter is Dr. Maria Kopseva, PhD in political science and postdoctoral fellow in global Arctic studies at UIT. Dr. Kopseva focuses on Sino-Russian relations in the Arctic amid the new balance of power and Russian and Chinese foreign policies. And Dr. Kopseva has recently received a Maria Skłodowska-Curie Action Individual Fellowship for a research project on Arctic security regime adaptation. So you will see how we will move from an overall theoretical perspective about security and theorizing different kinds of security to Dr. Lanteigne, who will talk about Chinese Arctic policy and the place of the Arctic in China's relations to the world. And then finally, Dr. Kopseva, who will talk about the Sino-Russian relationship. My own area of research is the relationship between international order and Arctic orders, where, in my view, Arctic order historically closely reflects international order. So during bipolar Cold War, the Cold War bipolarity between the United States and the Soviet Union, we had a bipolar Arctic, Nordic and North American on one side and the Soviet Arctic on the other side. And then with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had US unipolarity, which was the basis of a circumpolar Arctic order. And now, of course, US unipolarity is being replaced by what could perhaps be described as a loose Sino-American bipolarity, where also Russia has returned as a traditional great power. And that very much affects the Arctic, where we see the effects of those changes to international order also to Arctic order, which may create on the one hand, American-dominated Nordic and North American Arctic order, and on the other hand, a Russian Arctic with a significant Chinese financial involvement. But let me turn it over to our first speaker, Professor Gunhild Haagensen-Gjørv, and welcome to my good colleagues and welcome to the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thanks to LSE Ideas for inviting me to participate in this. And this is a seminar, webinar on China and the Arctic, and so I'm not going to talk about China. What I'm going to talk about is the backdrop, you could say, security in the Arctic, and what it is that China is a part of the encountering moments in this particular region of the world, which is an enormous region within the world. It's not homogeneous whatsoever. As many of you know, the Arctic encompasses 8 sovereign states with a big ocean in the middle. Across these states, the Arctic can differ very drastically. We have different political systems, different climates. The European Arctic is not the same at all to the Canadian or North American Arctic, or to the Russian Arctic, for example. So the situations are quite different. And what this means is that the perception of security can be quite different across this enormous landscape. So in a way, to say security in the Arctic is a bit simplistic, because we're actually talking about a very complex constellation of differing types of perspectives. And so I'll get into that in a second. But what's interesting, I was on a different conversation a short time ago, also to do with the Arctic, and we're going to talk about security in the Arctic. And one of the commentators talked about the Arctic as an outlier on security issues. And that was really interesting to me, because it's not the region of the world that most people are talking about when referring to security. Quite often it is about these sort of grander geopolitical constellations and the US versus something, or some state, could be the USSR, now it's with China, and Erasmus was getting into that. So is the Arctic an outlier? I mean, it's as much an outlier as many other regions in the world that may not necessarily be at the forefront of our discussions all the time when we're thinking about global security. But then nevertheless, it's having quite an impact on these different perspectives of security that have not just relevance in the Arctic region, but also globally. As Erasmus was saying, referring back to the time of the Cold War and such, I mean, the Arctic back then, which for some of you probably feels historical, for some of us, we lived through it. It was a region where The Cold War was, it was just happening there. This is the region that is in between the United States and the Soviet Union, and over which missiles would be flying. The defense systems were built up within this region. And that was the primary focus of the Arctic, insofar as the Arctic was playing a role. It had this sort of militarized type of focus. That did not mean that there were not people and societies living there, but of course that was the main, it only played that role in the security narrative. After the end of the Cold War, that whole defrosting, the warming of the Cold War, however you want to say it, it defrosted in the Arctic as well. And this was actually quite significant because for these Arctic states that had traditionally, particularly those that were part of the so-called Western alliances, the NATO alliance and the Eastern Bloc, here was this sort of warming up of potential cooperation. This enabled a lot of agreements to take place with regards to Arctic and Arctic governance and the relationships between these particular Arctic states, starting out very much with environmentally focused agreements, so that there was a recognition that for all these states, despite their perhaps differences politically, they had a common desire to preserve this region and to take care of this particular region. In the 1990s, then, you have the advances of all these sorts of agreements, and of course the creation of the Arctic Council, which is an international body where the 8 Arctic states play the primary role. They're the permanent seats in that body, and then became a permanent representation from Indigenous peoples as well. But it's an international body, and the atmosphere globally was amenable to this sort of interaction taking place. So at the same time, you also have this kind of explosion in security theory. Oh my God, we can think about security outside of a polarized bipolar dynamic between the US and the USSR. We can actually start thinking far more broadly. I mean, we had been doing so as scholars well before the early 1990s, but this was the opportunity to really sort of bring it forward, and ideas about environmental security and not least human security really started to be able to blossom. So it was the global dynamic at that time that allowed for these sorts of conversations to take place, and a recognition that security could mean much more than just this kind of Cold War confrontation. So then, of course, things started to cool down a little bit already. And by 2014, we have the rather well-known movement towards annexation, otherwise referred to by some circles, of Crimea by Russia. And this really cooled things down. And with NATO partners and many states around the world imposing sanctions on Russia, this had an impact on the relationships of these states also in the Arctic. Now, some would argue that no, that the Arctic is exceptional because of these agreements that were established back in the 1990s. There was such a well-entrenched system of governance and agreements. This includes not only the Arctic Council, but also like the UN Convention on the Laws of the Seas. So these are extremely important agreements to maintain and to regulate the relationship up in the Arctic. And these have actually played a very important role. So there's no state that is contravening these types of agreements. But nevertheless, the abilities to actually talk about more controversial topics have been rather problematic, and it has strained the relationships even in the Arctic. I should also add that in the Arctic Council, which many of you may know, that the Arctic Council has a clause or a little footnote that says, by the way, we're not going to talk about military security here. This was something that actually most of the states agreed upon. They didn't want to get into that kind of mud because this was sort of the most tense, potentially, charged theme between these states, no matter what. So so it's kind of nice that this particular institution is free of that discussion, or at least officially free of that discussion, because that discussion is taking place around that institution instead. So what we see then is we see that the Arctic is very much influenced by what's happening globally. So it's not somehow separate from global issues. And there's a type of reasoning or sort of a narrative that's been quite popular, particularly emanating from the 1990s, but Arctic exceptionalism, because that's where, everything is happening so peacefully and there is no conflict taking place. That there's no reason to go to full-scale conflict into the Arctic, not least because there's far more other things we can do instead. But also there are all of these agreements in place, and for all the states that are involved there is nothing in their interest to breach those particular agreements. But nevertheless, global issues influence those sorts of politics. But what's happening in the Arctic, of course, influences global politics as well, and not least with regards to climate change. And this we know because the temperatures are increasing at a much faster rate in the Arctic than they are in other parts of the world. Sea ice melting and sea rise is coming from the Arctic. The nature, the flora and the fauna in the Arctic is changing due to the changing temperatures, which in turn is having an impact on various types of industries globally, like not just in the Arctic, not least in fisheries. So you see there is this dynamic that goes Arctic and global. Environmental security, energy security, economic security are all crucially important in the Arctic. So, and there's also tensions there because the majority of the Arctic states are in fact oil and gas producing Arctic states. And no one's really stopping right now. And you see that, you understand that tension. We've got climate change, yet these are the states that are also, to this day, still continuing with the exploration of oil and gas. And this we can see in the Norwegian context as the most recently elected government, which is a majority Labour government or primarily Labour government, has allowed for the continuation of oil and gas exploration. So that is in tension with climate security and environmental security in this region, which are crucial to the region because they are impacting people's daily lives. We can see that in certain parts of the Arctic where, and this is where human security is coming in, where permafrost is disappearing. It's creating these craters, for example, in Russia, these methane craters that is releasing toxic gases, parts of the coastlines in Alaska, for example, are sliding into the sea. So there are these things that are impacting people's daily lives, their everyday security existence. At the same time that we have these tensions and these desires to have economic security through oil and gas exploration and so forth. In the past few years, there's been discussion about a militarization of the Arctic or remilitarization of the Arctic. And there's a lot that can be discussed there, and I will leave that to others to discuss if they would like. But what is quite interesting is the ways in which we perceive is it being militarized? Is it not being militarized? In the Norwegian context, we have moved troops and headquarters up north. That's happened over the past few years. There's a certain logic, necessity to this, but is this a militarization of the north? That would be in response to Russia, for example, as well. That's been having increased snap exercises, for example, on the Russian side. So you see this potential for increased militarization. But what's also really important, and this is where, I can sort of throw China in at the last minute, because I think I only have about a minute left, is that there is an interest in replacing or in finding alternatives for Arctic communities, as well as Arctic industries, to progress and to flourish. And China is playing an interesting role here, at least offering types of support, for example, for trains, for certain types of industrial production, and in any case, having more of a presence. This is in an economic sense, and for Arctic communities, this is really important. because a lot of these Arctic communities may be seeing changes in their own industrial capacities or their own capacities to really drive their economies. They need to look for alternatives, and it may not be coming from their southern governments, because the governments of these communities are often located in the so-called South. So China's playing an interesting economic role here, which also in turn can have a certain amount of influence in the Arctic. So this also impacts these this diverse, complex constellation of security perspectives in the Arctic, and it's really interesting to see where this can go from here, and where the interests will head. So I will leave my comments to that, because now I can't say much more about China, because I've got China experts on this panel. So I will leave it to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gunhild, for setting out, how to say, the theoretical landscape to think about these different securities, which I think provides a very useful intellectual roadmap for our continuing presentations and discussions. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Marc Montaigne. Marc, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Rasmus. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Gunhild, and thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. Very pleased to be here. So, when talking about China's interests in the Arctic, especially as they pertain to potential security ramifications, it's important to note right away two very inconvenient truths. First of all, China's a newcomer to the Arctic. It is still trying to work its way through the region, not only in terms of government to government or state to state, but to understand many different aspects of Arctic life on the local level, on the sub-regional level. And this is a process which takes time. It's not something that can be bought. It's not something that can be rushed. And the second inconvenient truth is that China is not an Arctic state, and in such that China is very dependent on the goodwill of the 8 Arctic states for much of its policies. So for all of the discussion, and there has been a lot of discussion about China seeking a revisionist agenda in the Arctic, that it has some kind of grand military plan for the Arctic, and this has been debated at length, especially over the past few years. And I should point out that one of the Arctic policies of the previous government in the United States was to directly point to China as a potential threat to the region because of its supposed revisionism. The fact is, China does have to tread very carefully in the Arctic because of its lack of knowledge, and because of the fact that it has no Arctic territory of its own, and therefore very much needs the support of the Arctic states, and that goes definitely double for Russia, for a lot of what it's looking for. So what is China seeking in the Arctic? Well, that has been the question that has been occupying quite a few researchers in the region, especially since China put out its first Arctic white paper back in January 2018. And the document was put under a microscope. Many were looking at it to find out, okay, are we seeing any signs that China is going to try to enter the Arctic, try to challenge the rules of the Arctic? But at the end of the day, we have seen over the past 5 years that China does have quite a few limitations in the region. Now, what has China been doing to kind of pursue an Arctic agenda? The first of the 3 kind of areas that Beijing is most interested in is scientific diplomacy. Now, when talking to Chinese officials about, okay, what is the core of Chinese Arctic policy, more often than not, you will get a reference to the fact that we want to develop scientific partnerships. We want to understand what is happening in the Arctic in regards to climate change of all of its various types, and how all of these changes will be affecting China itself. Now, this concern is not coming from nowhere. There's been quite a few scientific papers that have discussed how climate change and ice melt in the Arctic has affected weather patterns in China. Really cold weather in Shanghai, freak rainstorms in Beijing, change in pollution patterns up and down the Chinese coast. So China is trying to draw a direct link between what is happening in the Arctic and how China might be directly affected, not only environmentally, but also economically. So what China has been seeking to do is to engage in several projects designed to increase Chinese knowledge of the region. By far the most visible has been China's icebreaker projects. It now has 2 icebreakers currently functioning, the Zhuilong 1 and 2. It has also developed research facilities, the most prominent being the one in Nyalesund at Svalbard, the Yellow River Station. It also has a joint operation, scientific operation in northern Iceland, and it attempted to set up a similar installation in Greenland, although that did not come about, very likely due to political pressure. What China has been trying to do with its scientific prowess is to call for partnerships with Arctic states to better understand what exactly is happening in this part of the world. And China has also joined various other multilateral scientific missions in order to understand what is happening. But at the same time, science diplomacy serves Chinese interests in regards to China wanting to be seen as a valuable partner for ongoing research in the region. Now, that said, we are starting to see considerable concerns about what could be the strategic aspects of some of these scientific projects. China has sent icebreakers to many parts of the Arctic, and for mapping missions, for charting and so forth. And that has led to the question about what this data is going to be used for and whether this data is going to be transferred to military actors. And I say that's an extremely strong possibility. We also have similar concerns about dual use through various other types of monitoring projects which China has recently proposed. One of which being a project which came up last year. China expressed interest in sending a satellite to monitor shipping in the Northern Sea route. And again, where is that data going? And does this data have particular, military applications? So I would say in regards to science diplomacy, the concern here happens to deal with the dual use area. But nevertheless, China has insisted that its scientific interests are primarily in order to better understand the region and to better strike partnerships with like-minded countries wanting to know what climate change is actually all about. Now, the second strain, if you will, of China's Arctic interests, and this is the one which arguably gets the most attention, and what Gunhild mentioned before, is China's economic interest. Now, in the white paper on Arctic policy that China published a few years ago, it was very specific at the beginning, saying that states without any kind of Arctic territory cannot claim sovereignty in the Arctic. However, big underline, non-Arctic countries do have the right to engage in scientific and economic endeavors in keeping with international law, etc. And China's made it very clear that it considers the Arctic to be of considerable economic importance, not as important, one would say, as other regions, but certainly an area of interest. Why? Well, as has been noted many times, this is a region where a lot of resources are now starting to become accessible. I can talk about oil, gas, metals, minerals in various parts of the region. And China wants to take part in the development of that process and is very concerned that if it doesn't start to develop economic interest in the Arctic, it will be left out. Now, paramount among these projects, and this came about through Sino-Russian cooperation back in 2017, the development of the Polar Silk Road. Now, this has a very interesting history. When the Belt and Road Initiative was first coalescing back in 2013, many scholars were wondering, okay, where does the Arctic fit in with this? Because originally the Belt and Road was concentrating on Eurasia, Russia, over to Europe, eventually Africa, and then the various sea lanes, primarily the Indian Ocean, but one would also argue the Pacific Ocean. So the question is, where is the Arctic in all this? And when I ask the question, when others ask the question, very often I would get the answer, well, this is something we're looking at maybe 2 decades from now. This is really not a priority. But then you get to 2017, you start to see references in government documents about the Arctic as an emerging blue economic corridor. And then that was the signal that the Arctic was about to be incorporated into the Belt and Road, and that was codified in the 2018 white paper. But what is the Polar Silk Road? If you were to ask me, let's say 5 years ago, the map or what was being proposed would have looked considerably different. First of all, what China was seeking to do was to help Russia develop the Northern Sea route as a secondary shipping area, that it would propose all kinds of infrastructure projects, not only in Russia, but in the Nordic region, including potentially, setting up ports in northern Norway and maybe setting up a railway system here as well. Eventually setting up ports in Iceland, maybe in Greenland, and developing mining operations in both Greenland and Canada. So that was the big plan maybe 5 years ago. The thing is, though, a lot of these plans never came to fruition. We've seen a lot of political pushback from Denmark, from Sweden, from Canada, about what China wishes to do in regards to Arctic investment. So many of these proposed projects are still very much on the paper napkin stage. And most of the results of the Polar Silk Road pretty much begin and end with Russia. So I could talk about the Yamal natural gas project. I could talk about various port and transportation projects which are currently being discussed between the two countries. But nevertheless, China has identified the Arctic as a potential secondary route for maritime shipping. Not only the Northern Sea route, but there's the question of the Canadian Northwest Passage, whether that will be used, whether even the Central Arctic might eventually be used for Chinese shipping 15 years down the line when it's expected to be open water. So now, because of the political pushback, because of the fact that some of China's economic ambitions in the region have not come to fruition, and certainly the, shall we say, post-pandemic situation has also put many of these projects on pause. It's still a bit of an open question what China's eventual economic plans for the Arctic will be. That said, we are still seeing a great deal of Chinese enthusiasm for its eventual development. And third and last, the area that China is looking at has to do with the area of governance. Now, China is a formal observer in the Arctic Council, and it has been since 2013. And Beijing has said up and down that it is completely happy with that situation, that it wants to engage Arctic and other non-Arctic states. But we have a question to ask here. Let's go forward 10 years when China has invested more in the region, more Chinese vessels can be seen. Will China still be happy as an observer in the region? Or will it start to kind of push against the boundaries a bit to say, okay, we would like a little bit more of a say in Arctic affairs? And there have been other cases, such as the Polar Code and such as the recent fishing ban in the Central Arctic, where China was a direct participant in the process. So Beijing has made it very clear that while it is very happy to engage the Arctic Council, that it completely observes the law of the sea in the Arctic, that it also believes that Arctic governance should be, and I'm using the government term here, multi-tiered, and that there should be a role for non-Arctic states. Now, how that is going to play out, that does make a few Arctic governments a bit nervous. So China has been taking advantage of various opportunities to kind of work with the Arctic Council, but also work around it a bit to advertise more directly what it seeks to do. And China, for example, is very often represented at major Arctic Track 2 conferences, such as the Arctic Circle and Arctic Frontiers. And it has also started to be a little bit more direct in regards to, well, maybe if emerging areas of governance appear, including the potential for some kind of security dialogue, yes, we need to be there. Chinese scholars have referred to this as the Melon problem. The nightmare scenario for Beijing would be that if the Arctic is cut up into 8 pieces like a melon, and if you're an Arctic state, great, you get to participate. And if you're not an Arctic state, too bad. This is exactly what China does not want. So this is why I tend to be a bit skeptical about articles and studies which suggest that China is supportive of Arctic militarization. If anything, that would put China at a very serious disadvantage because of its geography and because of the fact that any kind of serious kind of zero-sum game in the Arctic would automatically put it at a great disadvantage, especially since China, as I said at the beginning, is very dependent on Russia and various other Arctic states for much of its policies. So the question which I will leave this with is, China may not be an Arctic state. It considers itself a near Arctic state, Jinbeiji Guojia, and we can talk at length about what that means. But I think at the end of the day, what China is really seeking is to be considered a stakeholder and to be given the status of an Arctic player, if not necessarily an Arctic state. Now, how that can be reconciled with the concerns of the Arctic state, the security concerns, the changing situation in the Arctic, which Gunhild very comprehensively explained, is very much the open question here. So when we talk about Arctic security, it is really, really important, first of all, to look at what is happening versus what might happen. because these two very often get confused. These two very often get kind of mixed around a bit. But that said, China is an emerging Arctic power. It is an emerging Arctic player. And it's only a question of what is the trajectory of China's role in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was an excellent introduction to excellent overview over the Arctic in the foreign and economic policy of a rising great power, China. And now to go straight into the most important Chinese Arctic relationship, China's relationship with Russia. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Maria Kopseva, who is exactly an expert on the Sino-Russian Arctic relationship. Maria, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to this conference. And I'm very glad to contribute to this discussion with my brief presentation. Let me share slides. Do you see my slides?
Yes, we see it fine, and
yeah,
good. Thank you.
Okay, so we heard a very detailed overview of China's interests from Mark, and I will just further elaborate more specifically on this China-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. And I also suggest to look at this area, first of all, paying attention on Russian interest in the Arctic. So Russia is, of course, the largest Arctic state, and it whole has this territory that stretches along the Arctic coast from Europe to Asia, which now has already navigable routes and which holds abundant resources, including hydrocarbons and minerals. It's also worth mentioning that due to the Soviet Union legacy, Russia also has a special strategic interest in this area, especially in the Kola Peninsula region. So the natural interest of Russia, which avails such an opportunity of having Arctic resources and routes, is to use them via development and via cooperation with both European and Asian actors. And it is reflected in national documents, in the recent Arctic strategy of Russia by 2035. It also reflected in the actions where Russia invests into these territories. It restructures administrative governance of them. It plans the urbanization, a new type of urbanization in line with the new environmental standards. And it also works on the many environmental issues, including those that remained from the Soviet legacy. And all of these areas requires more investments, more attention, and this is a strategic plan for Russia to proceed. So China is one of partners in this area. And as Mark mentioned, for China, the Arctic is a part of a global picture. And cooperation with Russia is just one of options. But of course, when we are talking about Russia-China relations in the Arctic right now, we have to think of the overall unprecedented level of bilateral relations between the two states, which now are titled as comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction. And this cooperation takes its roots in probably maybe the key point was the Treaty of Good Neighborhood and Friendly Cooperation of 2001, which sets principles of rather flexible and reliable long-term cooperation. And now we see a very rapid rapprochement and interaction in various areas. And of course, maybe the key indicator is in trade, where China in recent years became one of the major trade partners of Russia. And for instance, in 2020, it took the trade with China took 18.3% of the overall trade. But still, it's also worth mentioning that Europe still is the major trade partner of Russia with 38.5%. And it also the major investment. And in the Arctic, as well a key partner. So on such a backdrop with relationship developed in various areas between Russia and China, cooperation in the Arctic looks quite moderate. So, of course, Mark mentioned these negotiations of projects in railroads in the Russian Arctic and development of resources, etc. So these negotiations were running years, but currently we only have two successful, really prominent projects, and these are Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG. China, with its corporations of CNPC and also Silk Road Fund, became a very important stakeholder there. It also became an investor, and it also contributes now with engineering, construction, and delivering of the LNG, etc. So also, as Mark mentioned, these projects allow China to accumulating experience of huge extracting projects in the circumpolar north. At the same time, of course, it is international projects, multilateral, with also a very important role of European partners, namely Total, a French corporation, which also holds not only a stake in these projects, but also in Novatek, a Russian company. So Total holds 19.4% in Novatek. And also with the participation of Japanese corporations. At the same time, these are projects which very much discussed as Russia-China cooperation in the Arctic. It also worth mentioning that when they were supposed to be launched before 2014, the key partners were from Europe and the United States, as well as investors. And the Ukrainian crisis affected Russia with sanctions as well, and Russian cooperation with Europe and America. And at that time, China became a partner who is ready to invest in these projects. So, of course, it is a great achievement. At the same time, as I mentioned, it is how to say, it's it is a moderate achievement compared to what have been discussed all these years. And at the same time, it also reflects the key basis of cooperation, the ground for cooperation between Russia and China in the Arctic, which is economy. So together with Rasmus Bertelsen and our colleagues at Sorbonne, we were discussing this emerging Arctic energy system, where Russia becomes a core chain connecting Europe and Asian markets. And at such a backdrop, of course, it's worth mentioning that this map reflects only part of those projects. And here you may see this supposed to be built quite soon, hubs in Murmansk and Kamchatka, where Total will be one of the key partners as well for launching them, which also will affect maybe the boost cooperation in the LNG industry in the Arctic. So this is probably the ground for cooperation in the Russian Arctic, which gives rise for political arrangement and planning. And here we have the Russian plans of the development of the Northern Sea Route, which goes here in this part, and it's supposed to be a route capable for delivering LNG to Asian markets. And also we have this idea of the Ice Silk Road, which also Mark mentioned. It doesn't have any particular maps which specify what projects or steps should China take, but it is like an arrangement, political arrangement around this development, where China can probably guide its policies in the area in a more coherent way. And of course, there is a correlation, there is coherence between these ideas, which gives at the same time reasons for two characteristics of cooperation between Russia and China in the Arctic, which I would like to emphasize. And first, it is strategic independence, which both states try to achieve. So for Russia, you may understand easily while looking at this map, it is quite obvious to try to balance its supplies to both European and Asian markets. China lays right near the border, which is more than 4,000 miles. And China is a growing LNG market. And as well, for China, at least from this very beginning, it was very important to develop cooperation with other Arctic states and not only being dependent on the Russian area. And it also gives another reason for another characteristic, which is a pragmatism. Maybe a natural also part of economic or business relations between partners. On such a backdrop, just to finalize my today's talk, I would like to point out a new factor which affects cooperation in the area, and this is the green transition. So the green transition, of course, it was discussed for many years, but probably it is developing faster than many could expect. And it is already affecting the Arctic energy system, cooperation in the area. And it will have a strong impact further on relations, Russian relations with European and Asian partners in the Arctic. Green transition is a new development that sets or changing values and norms of the Arctic energy development. And it also provides a new dimension for cooperation between Russia and China. Of course, currently, again, European partners are leading in this process in the Russian Arctic. But at the same time, China is working very intensively on its own, greening its own economy. As I mentioned, it's a growing LNG market, and in nearest 15 years, it is quite easy to expect. It is quite natural to expect the development in this area. Yeah, so that is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you also very much to Gunhild and Mark. And I think we've had three very, very thought-provoking presentations, which I think in an excellent way shows the depth and breadth of the Arctic international relations and security research at UIT, the Arctic University of Norway. And now I come to think about, and that is probably an occupational weakness, we are all educators of international relations, and I come to think about how to say the value of theory. And there may be a good deal of students listening to this, and often students of international relations, they aspire to work in international affairs, and they may think that theoretical topics and theoretical exams, that's something you pass, and then you can go out into the real world and deal with how to say the real topics and the real world and put theory behind you. But there I always say that theory is extremely useful, not least in policy and strategic questions, because it helps you structure your own thinking and it helps you investigate the assumptions of others. So my own point of departure, as I referred to, is how to say systemic theory, structural theory. How is the international system developing, and where of course the major variable is the distribution of power between the strongest states, which does not say that there are no other actors. It simply says that states are the dominant actors. And I come to the question I'm left with listening to my three colleagues is very much, to paraphrase Monty Python, what's so special about the Chinese? Is China not simply another rising power? We in the West, we have been used to dominate the international system for centuries, since imperialism, colonialism, and in that respect, I would actually count the Soviet Union as a Western power. Culturally, philosophically, etc. And they are, of course, having a non-Western rising power as China is an enormous change, and it upsets the system very much, and it upsets Western views of the system. So there, my immediate question is, what's so special about the Chinese? Isn't China just another rising great power? So, for example, Mark referred to raise the question of Chinese scientific engagement in the Arctic, where there are great suspicions about the dual use potential of Chinese polar research. But there, I'm a Danish national myself, and there's a very well documented history of US strategic Cold War research in Greenland. So is Chinese strategic polar research, is that in principle different than US and other Western great power strategic research? And Gunhild raised the question of these of the Arctic small states and regional and sub-state actors. And that raises a very interesting question of the agency of smaller and middle powers in the international system in general, and and of non-state actors. So to what extent can small and middle powers moderate the what I would see as the structural forces originating in the shifts of material power between great powers and superpowers? So that was I made so many notes from these presentations. So and then to Maria. Maria, your presentation, it reminds of that. I think there is a great tendency in Western, both academic and policy discussions, to see the Sino-Russian relationship detached from, on the one hand, the Western-Russian relationship and the Western-Chinese relationship. So instead of, how to say, seeing the Sino-Russian relationship in isolation, we should rather look at this as an interacting triangle where we have the West, China, and Russia in each corner, and that these relationships affect each other very much. So my question to you, Maria, would be, if the West-Russia relations and perhaps the West-China relations change, how would that affect the Sino-Russian relationship? So these were some immediate observations from me. I can see we have a lot of good questions coming from the audience, but listening to my very good colleagues, I couldn't help abusing my position to ask these questions. Who would like to go ahead? Gunhild.
Yeah, and interesting and good questions, but I will try to be brief. But as far as like the abilities of so-called small states or middle powers to, I mean, if I paraphrase your question, you know, to what degree do they have any influence on the particular sort of geopolitical and structural trajectories that seem to be taking place in the Arctic? The one thing that comes to mind first is that globally speaking, a lot of the Arctic states are what you would consider, you know, which have classically been called small states or middle powers or middle states and stuff. But in the Arctic context, not so much. They're heavy hitters in the Arctic context, and they can therefore punch above their weight, as is probably an overused phrase. And they're also affluent. And they do have the capacity to in a sense, at least with regards to the economic investment, that type of influence that, say, China is trying to bring to the fore at the moment, these countries have some capacity to respond to that, if they wish, come with alternatives, or at least have some form of control and options with regards to the degree to which China can operate on their sovereign territory. And that's also an important thing too, that they're both they're both like heavy hitters in many respects in the Arctic, but this isn't sort of like some big ass wasteland where, you know, it's people are running all over the place. It's actually a fairly well regulated part of the globe. And China has no interest, as far as I understand, has no interest to contravene those regulations. So I think the ability to influence how much China can influence is definitely there. To what degree, I can't really say, but I don't think that they are lightweights in this process. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Gunhild. Mark, Maria?
Well, I can go next very briefly. Thank you for your questions. I mean, to answer some of it would probably require another seminar, so I'll try to keep it brief. But I would say what makes China distinct and why it is relevant to the Arctic. First of all, you simply cannot get away from the economic factor. You simply cannot get away from the fact that unlike the Soviet Union and unlike, I could argue, previous great powers, China's economic capabilities are simply not to be underestimated. Not only in regards to the obvious second largest economy in the world and its ability to influence many areas of economic and financial discourse, but we were also talking about an economy which is evolving at a very rapid rate. There's still the perception of China as a manufacturing power, and that is still very much the case, but I could talk extensively about China's gains in the technological areas, the fact that China is now seen as a competitor to the West in many areas of emerging technology. I can talk about everything from quantum computing to AI to blockchain. And that economic capability is very key to what China is seeking in the Arctic. The whole idea of China as an Arctic economic partner is the concept that China does have the financial weight to potentially affect the economies of its Arctic partners in many ways. And this is where things get very complicated when we see the debate, for example, over, let's say, the use of Huawei in communications, or whether China should invest in, let's say, this railway project or this communication project. It really leads to some very serious debates. The fact that China does have the ability to use its economic diplomacy, not only to influence, but also in some cases to pressure. Some states, including in the Arctic, Canada, Sweden, have all experienced, Norway a few years ago, experienced Chinese economic pressure. So that has to be kept in mind. The second reason why China is distinct is that China is growing up. China is becoming a great power, a potential superpower, in an arena, including the Arctic, where we have more institutions, regimes, organizations, laws, however you want to call them, than ever before. So the ability for China to make its presence felt, the ability for China to advertise what it can do or what its interests are, or this is what I think the Arctic should be, is much stronger than what would have existed a few decades ago. And again, China is, on one hand, trying not to challenge any of this. It's not trying to challenge its role in the Arctic, going up against the Arctic Council or the Law of the Sea. But it is constantly saying that, look, all of these organizations are here. More are going to appear. There's going to be some discussion about a security dialogue at some point. We need to be there. And China has been extremely good at, to go back to your point about theory, structural power. Understanding where the power within structures lie and understanding how to make the most of it to get what it is seeking.
Thank you very much, Mark. Maria.
Yes. Thank you for the questions. And actually, may I a bit also add some points to a question that you asked, Mark?
Sure, go ahead.
I would like to, so the question, if China is different from other big powers, etc., or if it is challenging the Arctic, etc. So I would like to say that, of course, as Mark mentioned, China is raising economic power, and that's why it is a challenger towards the United States in many ways, globally, first of all. But at the same time, probably the Arctic is a special case for this. And I would like to refer to a book by Manjari Miller, Why Nations Rise, the recent book, where she discussed the problem of raising powers. And her argument is that in many cases, maybe in most of cases, the rising powers try to keep the norms which already exist in the order, in order to legitimize its position there. Actually, there are quite a lot of debates if China is what is the China's legitimacy in the Arctic, etc. For instance, I recently read that such an idea that, for instance, this statement of China that it named itself as a neo-Arctic state, it's strengthening the legitimacy of China in the Arctic. And I personally quite have doubts about it, because here we should think of what is the Arctic Order, as Rasmus, you mentioned. What is this, and who are the key players there and decision makers? And I would say that what gave or what provided legitimacy to China in the Arctic was first and foremost the decision to grant the permanent observer status in the Arctic Council in 2013. And that was a decision made by Arctic states. In general, it was a decision to make the Arctic more open, and not only for China, but for other countries that are able to contribute. So in this regard, probably in the Arctic, I would say that China is keeping the same rules and norms that are already settled there. Another question is that if China can challenge some of them, but it is already a more precise approach, I would say. And in terms of your question of West Russia-China relations, so here it should be somehow clarified. What do you mean on changes, if they are good or bad, to the bad or to the good, or and between what actors? But in general, it's easy to say that worsening relations with Russia and China gives more reasons for these actors to collaborate, and in the Arctic as well. And it is reflected even in those facts that I was mentioning today with regard to energy cooperation. Yeah.
Thank you very much to all of you, and I'm dying to ask follow-up questions, but we have about, I think, 20 minutes left. And I'd like to, there are some very good questions in the from the audience. Jan Selečný from the Czech Republic is asking about this most recent European Union, I think it's the European Parliament or the European Union, which has an idea about banning import of fossil fuels from the Arctic. And that is, of course, probably part of the European Union's climate change approach, but I don't really know if people thought about what that would mean for the European Union's relationship with Russia. And there, apparently China has not, of course, Moscow has objected to that, but China has not. And I think that comes very much back to this triangular relationship that Maria just reflected on. So such a change in the energy relationship between the European Union and Russia, what would that mean for China? Then Pavel Devyatkin from the Arctic Institute is asking if commercial and scientific cooperation with China can build trust, confidence, and prevent escalation to conflict, especially between China and NATO states. Let's keep it with those two questions first and responses to that. So this European Union idea about banning import of Arctic fossil fuels and what that means for the EU-Russia-China relationship and the confidence-building potential of commercial and scientific relations. Maria.
Yeah, so here I would like to say that let's suppose that it will take place and it will be banned. So what will it mean for Europe and for China? So I think that currently for Europe, it would mean, if it is banned right now, that would mean a lot of complications in terms of the green transition. And that was, for instance, already observed in some developments, like how it affects economies in Europe, or those economies that try to, for instance, refuse the using of nuclear power. Then it turns to be that it is impossible to sufficiently replace currently the energy sources with anything else but coal, and it turns to not to greening but to more pollution for these states, like for instance it happens in Germany or in Poland, or it was happening. So the problem is that the green transition probably it has to have some steps, and I personally think that this process could positively affect the Arctic development, also in terms of extracting industries' standards, rules, and norms. And this is how to say, maybe the opposite side of this coin, when we think that it is not that environmentally friendly to use the fossil fuel at all. Of course, I don't think that China would be interested in banning gas supplies from Russia based on such considerations. And in such perspective, you can imagine that probably China become more a bigger customer of Russia if it really takes place. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Maria. Mark, Gunhild, what is the trust-building potential of commercial and scientific relations? Can it overcome the structural forces I keep going on about?
Is that your question or from the audience?
That was my twist on the audience question.
Yeah, well, I don't think it goes one way or another. I guess I'm not a fatalist, or what do you call determinist, or such, that the structure determines everything, and I don't think so. And I think in part we've seen that the structure does not necessarily determine everything, because we tend to see surprises in global politics when we don't expect it. So but I think it's some of the only mechanisms we have. And trust and confidence building exercises have had an effect in certain areas of global politics. If you take a look at sort of arms control negotiations, it's not completely guided by some sort of kind of structural relationship that no one has any particular control over. So there are possibilities for this, but sometimes it can be limited. And it really depends on the warmth in the room, so to speak. We saw that there's a lot more warmth in the room in the 1990s, but those circumstances were also rather peculiar in some respects. Yeah, but I think it's too complicated to say that it necessarily is guided by one thing or another, but I don't think any states should ever give up on trust and confidence building mechanisms there, because they do play an important role.
And I can add here that Norway, as a very affluent Arctic and polar small state, which of course Norway's foreign and security policy is structured, it's guided by being a neighbor of Russia and before the Soviet Union. And Norway invests a lot in, for example, educational and research and cultural and health and environmental people-to-people relations with Russia. And I think all of us here from UIT, we are very active in those relations. So that's exactly an example of agency of a small state. Mark, anything to add here?
Yeah, the first point about the European Union, yes, when the paper came out, not only did Moscow react to it pretty badly, but it also didn't go down too well in the Northern Norwegian press. The perception being that the European Union does not really have a clear idea of Arctic economics and should, try to stick to its own knitting, so to speak. I would say why China hasn't responded to it for the simple reason that there's simply no gain in doing so. That China's kind of energy footprint in the Arctic, again, once you take Russia out of the equation, is extremely light. There was some talk about cooperation between China, Iceland, Norway back a few years, offshore oil exploration. It didn't pan out very well. There was some discussion about Chinese investment in potential Greenlandic oil projects, but that too is on hold because of the new government not wanting to pursue those types of endeavors. So you have China really not in a position to try to really comment on the issue of oil and gas development. And China itself is under a great deal of pressure to make very sure that its own Belt and Road initiatives are sufficiently green. So I would say that China would probably want to hold back and say, okay, how is this story going to unfold? Because there is going to be a lot of pressure on the oil and gas industry in the Arctic. Oil prices just hit $84 a barrel. So the demand is certainly going up. So I think China feels that its best interest is simply hang back on this one, not necessarily comment on what the EU may or may not be able to propose in terms of environmental restrictions. In regards to scientific cooperation and trust building, yeah, just to pick up on Gunhild's point, China has found it on occasion very frustrating to propose, let's say, a scientific project, such as a potential scientific station in Greenland, only to be kind of pushed backward due to political concerns. And I think a lot of that, I think Beijing is starting to come to the realization that it's not just about, okay, I want to set up this joint project so we can study so-and-so. It does have a political element and it does have to do with trust. And that goes back to the concern that many Arctic states have. On one hand, China expertise, just like any outside expertise, would be very welcome, because these are a lot of very serious problems when we talk about the Arctic environment, and the more people looking at it, the better. But then you have the concern, where is this information going to go? Is any of this information going to benefit China strategically? So there's always that kind of underlying concern there. And the only way to resolve that is, again, the question of trust. And right now, I think that's going to be a very difficult obstacle in many ways to overcome.
Talking about trust, that reminds me of one of our young colleagues, Dr. Benjamin Schaller, who recently finished a PhD supervised by Gunhild, and where I was had the pleasure of being co-supervisor, and where Benjamin developed very, very interesting work on trust and trust building. We have very little time left, so I will pick some of the questions from the audience and then invite the panelists to make any final remarks responding to them. So Dr. Jennifer Cassidy from Oxford is asking about Russian public diplomacy in the Arctic. And now, of course, Russia has just taken over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. And that is, of course, very important for Russian foreign policy and Arctic policy. And I think Russia will very much want to engage and reach out as chairman of the Arctic Council. To what extent do you think that will be successful? Louis Lassu, or I'm not sure about the pronunciation, is asking about the role of Arctic resources in China's socioeconomic development, where, of course, the stability of Chinese society is very much based on continuing growth and continuing improvement of living conditions. And the role of Arctic resources in that development, and also the interest of the European Union in improving its relations with Russia in, how to say, the greater picture of things between the United States, the European Union, Russia, and China. And Jack Alsher is asking a number of interesting questions. One is about comparing China in the Arctic and China in the Antarctic. And then finally, Rudy is at LSE is reminding us of who I'm sure has been a great source of inspiration to all of us, Professor Susan Strange, how energy and climate change would affect Susan Strange, interconnected structures of power, security, production, finance, and knowledge. And the questions just keep coming in. Now, also our good colleague, Lisa Kaupila, who I have the pleasure of co-supervise, is talking about the negative experiences of, for example, Sri Lanka and Australia and their effect on perceptions of China. So a minute or two from each of the panelists, if you have any responses to these great questions and your final remarks. Who will go ahead? Mark.
Okay, thank you. These are excellent questions. I want to just address very quickly the Antarctica question, because this has also been an interest of mine. I had an opportunity to do a little bit of work on the Antarctic Treaty System. So 2017, Beijing hosts the Antarctic Treaty System Summit that year, puts out a policy paper, again, very heavy on scientific cooperation, very heavy on the various areas that China can contribute to understanding climate change in Antarctica. But some of the opening policy speeches at the meeting were very telling. You had Chinese officials saying, again, up and down, that we respect the Antarctic Treaty System, that we very much want to follow international law on the continent, but if the situation changes, China will adapt its policies accordingly. And that was taken by many to assume that, let's say, some provisions such as the Madrid Protocol get changed and economic activity is able to take place in Antarctica, we'll be there. We'll be in a position to change our tune and to engage in this kind of economic activity. So both in the Arctic and Antarctica, what China is primarily interested in right now is status, is to be viewed as a stakeholder, but also to be there, to actually have interests front and center for when the situation changes, because the assumption is that we are going to be seeing very significant political and strategic changes at both poles. So I think that looking at Antarctica will give, quite an interesting indication about China's Arctic issues as well. Now, in terms of what China needs and how the Arctic can help, well, you can certainly argue that there are other parts of the Belt and Road which are more economically important. I can talk about South Asia, Indian Ocean, Africa, the Pacific. But what makes the Arctic distinct, it's not only just the oil and gas and resources which may be down there, but it is also the importance of the region as a potential shipping corridor that's been discussed, but also the fact that this is a region which is relatively politically predictable. Like, with maybe a few exceptions here and there, we know pretty much where things stand politically and strategically in the Arctic. And that is a very important point which China looks very carefully at. Like right now, especially just looking at the events over the past few months, China is really craving stability in its economics and trade because there hasn't been that much of it lately. So in looking at the importance of the Arctic, I would look to that particular aspect. Even though the Arctic is never going to be #1 on China's economic priority list, it is still very much there. Even if it's number 10 or number 20, it still deserves to be looked at.
Thank you very much, Mark. Gunhild or Maria? Gunhild?
I think with regards to the specifics around China, I of course want to defer to my more knowledgeable colleagues, Mark and Maria. But I just, as a last comment, I do want to emphasize the importance of the trust and of the interesting roles different states have to play, particularly in the Arctic context. Where I would say that the Arctic is rather unique is the fact that the power dynamics are a bit different than globally. And that's something worth looking at. And I mentioned this already before, where you have like so-called small states that are punching against above their weight. That's why I say so-called small states, because it depends on the context, what kind of state power we're actually talking about. And in that particular region, you have a constellation of states that are rather unique, very wealthy compared to many other sort of conglomerations of states. And just because of that, they have different options on the table than they may otherwise have had if they were a different part of the world. So it's a very interesting part of the region to take a look at. And despite the fact that I'm not an adherent of this Arctic exceptionalism narrative, I think it's also something not to underestimate, that there's a great interest both with big powers, small powers, great powers, whatever you want to call, to follow the law in that particular region. And we can't underestimate that either. And there's a reason for that. Obviously, their interests dictate that. But that's also something to be to keep in mind and think that it's not all going down the crapper, so to speak. So it's worth following. It's a very complex region.
Thank you very much, Gunhild. Maria?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for these questions. Lots of things to think about. But just to make a short comment with regard to the Russian chairmanship in the Arctic Council these years. So I would like to say that, of course, the relations in the Arctic, they are very much affected by relations globally, relations between states and key actors. But at the same time, it's also maybe not the, it's a part of this exceptionalism narrative. But anyway, Arctic has always been a place where somehow the dialogue is possible. And in terms of these issues of green transition, probably, and also it has been mentioned by many experts, that current moment seems to be quite fruitful for leading a dialogue in terms of these environmental and climate issues, because of the new policy of the United States and the Russian emphasis on sustainable development in the Arctic during the Arctic chairmanship period. So at the same time, just to mention that Arctic has turned to be not only a place for the Arctic, for discussions about the Arctic, but also for the dialogue with regards to global issues like this strategic stability, as it happened before. So I would say that currently we have good grounds for such a dialogue and trust building in the region.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much to all of my colleagues, and many thanks to the London School of Economics for all the arrangements for this webinar, and thanks to the audience for excellent questions. Malik Müller from University of Greenland asking if this webinar is posted later, and our London School of Economics colleagues must contradict me, but I believe it is posted later. And I will just finish by saying that this was the range and state of research on these topics from the Arctic University of Norway. And for these questions, it is, of course, very, very important to be in close both teaching and research cooperation with our colleagues in Russia and China, which we all very much are. So thank you very much to the panelists, to the London School of Economics and the Arctic University of Norway, and to the audience. And have a good evening. Thank you.